The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's talk about Beto O'Rourke. He is the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senator from Texas. He's facing off against incumbent total extremist Ted Cruz, and I've been talking about this race for a while, and it is getting more and more interesting now with fewer than 8, about 7.5 weeks left at this point until the 2018 midterm elections. And if you look across the 435 seats in the House of Representatives, the 100 seats in the U.S. Senate, Ted Cruz is one of the most extreme, prominent Republicans out there. There are definitely more extreme Republicans that you've probably never heard of, but Ted Cruz ran for president. He's a well-known Republican. And if it were possible to eliminate Ted Cruz from the U.S. Senate, it would be a massive, massive accomplishment. Not only does he have the power of incumbency, Texas is a red state. It's an uphill battle. We've spoken about it before. So when in the past I've reported to you Beto O'Rourke had some solid fundraising last month, Beto O'Rourke is looking good in a recent poll, we all sort of know that we want to be cautiously optimistic, we want to take every race seriously, but in the end, in a red state with an incumbent Republican, it would be normal to expect that undecideds and people who aren't sure if they are voting would sort of skew towards or break towards the incumbent, who also happens to be a member of the party that is dominant in that state, Republicans in Texas. But regardless, it's a very, very important race to follow. We've now learned that the Republican Party and Republican donors are so worried about the possibility of Ted Cruz being taken down by Beto O'Rourke that prominent Republican donors are diverting money that they plan to spend in other races, in other states altogether, and putting that money into helping Ted Cruz win re-election, a seat that by many accounts would normally be a very, very safe Republican seat. You might remember Rick Tyler. Rick Tyler was the communications director for Ted Cruz during his 2016 campaign, his presidential campaign, that is. He went on MSNBC and he said, this is the reality today. Beto O'Rourke is a likable guy. He's running a good campaign. He's an interesting candidate. But the important impact that that's having is that not only is it not a guaranteed win for Ted Cruz, money is now going to Ted Cruz that could go to Republicans in other parts of the country. Take a listen to Rick Tyler on MSNBC.
Beto O'Rourke has just been a very interesting candidate and has run a tremendous campaign, and he's raised a ton of money. He's sort of electrified the left. I think Ted Cruz is likable enough in Texas to win, and he should win. The problem right now is, this is a close race. This is anywhere between 0 percentage point and 4 points, which NBC has it at, and it shouldn't be. It should be a 10, 12, 15-point race. Now, here's the problem. This is a $50 million race right now, and when you have Club for Growth and Americans for Prosperity and the Koch brothers all diverting resources from races that they want to pick up, which just went through on the Democratic side, moving that money and those resources to Texas, that keeps the Republican Party from competing in other states. So Tennessee now looks like it could be a pickup because you have an unusual Democratic candidate there who was governor, a popular governor.
This is very, very, very good news because this is now bigger than Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. And what I mean by that is challenging an incumbent Republican senator in Texas and putting up a good fight, even if you lose, is a great thing if you start to influence the midterms more broadly. And that's exactly what Beto O'Rourke is doing, because every single dollar that a Republican was going to spend in Tennessee, as Tyler says, or Ohio, or wherever else, every single dollar that doesn't get spent there and instead gets spent trying to help Ted Cruz keep his seat, that not only helps Beto O'Rourke, or at least shows that Ted Cruz is in danger, but it puts other Republican seats at risk. How is the polling looking? I always am sort of very cautious when I talk about polling because I don't want to inadvertently keep anybody home. Everybody needs to go out and vote. But the polling is looking very close. It's a statistical tie. There's an Emerson College poll from last month which has Cruz at +1. +1 when your margin of error is 3 or 4 percentage points is a statistical tie. So we have an incumbent Republican senator, a very well-known one in Texas, a sort of celebrity senator in a sense, who is in a real situation where he may get knocked out. These opportunities don't come up that often, or at least in the last few decades, they haven't. This is one to work on. This is one to phone bank for. This is one to support. And before you tell me, because I know there are some of you, I look at the YouTube comments, I read my own tweets, I'm looking at my own Instagram comments. I know that there are people who are going to say, David, have you fallen for the Beto O'Rourke scam? Beto O'Rourke, some of you will say, because you already have, is not really a progressive. He is one of these finance bro, centrist Democrats who's playing progressive. That is a perfectly fair debate to have, but we're talking about Texas, and we're talking about Ted Cruz. The alternative is Ted Cruz. Don't miss the forest for the trees. This is like the people who said there's no difference between Trump and Hillary, so I'm going to vote for whoever, I'm going to stay home. Look at how wrong they are. Look at how wrong they have been vis-a-vis the Supreme Court and so many other ways. That's missing the forest for the trees. Is Beto O'Rourke the progressive idol that I would say if I just pick my ideal candidate, do I end up with Beto O'Rourke? Of course I don't. But we're talking about maybe knocking out Ted Cruz here, and every single one of us should be supporting Beto O'Rourke in this race. We are going to continue scaling up our coverage of the 2018 midterm elections as we get closer and closer. Now 7.5 weeks away. And what I want to talk to you about today is that there is a major, major growing problem for Republicans and for Donald Trump. And as a result of Donald Trump's lack of popularity in the Midwest, okay, the overall advantage for Democrats in the upcoming midterms has grown significantly over the last 2 months. And there are all sorts of different voter models you can look at that look at the Senate, that look at the House of Representatives based on leaning and likely seats and different likely voter models. But the big picture is that the numbers have gone significantly in the direction of Democrats over the last 2 months. The voting group that is responsible for that swing away from Republicans and Trump-endorsed Republicans and towards Democrats are voters in the Midwest of the United States of America. They have swung 13 percentage points since July towards Democrats. And it's not just one poll. There's this national NPR Marist poll, which shows that the 2018 midterm sort of outlook has swung significantly toward Democrats over the last 2 months. If you look at Marist state-by-state polls, you will see that the big changes are in the Midwest, and it is again away from Republicans and towards Democrats. Now, this could actually be, it's almost like kind of obvious, but it doesn't happen that often. This could actually be people in the Midwest realizing that Trump is screwing them big time and is screwing them specifically more than he's screwing most other people in the United States of America. Trump's abortive tariffs, which I've been talking about for months, are bad for mostly everyone, but they're especially bad for people in the Midwest who work in farming and who work in manufacturing, to pick a couple of industries. Wouldn't it be wonderful if, quite simply, people reacted to politicians passing policy that's bad for them by saying, I'm going to vote for someone else? The rich do it, right? The rich see very clearly, oh, okay, this is who's going to give me a tax cut, or this is who's going to give my business a tax reduction, and that's who I'm going to vote for, and I'm going to use the money that I have, surplus money, because I've been getting those tax cuts from Republican presidents for a long time, and I am going to refunnel it back in to people who are going to pass laws that are good for my checkbook, good for my pocketbook, good for my bank account, whatever metaphor or analogy you want to use. What if the farming industry and the manufacturing industry in the Midwest simply said, this guy's screwing us, we're going to vote for someone else. We're going to put aside what might be differences on social issues, and we're going to vote for somebody who is not actively part of the problem that is screwing us day after day after day. Now let's talk about what needs to happen in the Midwest and in other parts of the country in November. Polls are nice, but voting is what counts. And President Obama, former President Obama, has been talking about this, and so have many others. Whatever the polls say, these Midwesterners and everybody else must get out and vote. And we are going to start putting together possible sort of result scenarios. 538 has been doing some really good work on this, and there are other websites that are doing really, really good mathematical work here. And all of that matters, but every single person that watches the show, that listens to the show, needs to treat whatever race you can participate in by voting or by phone banking or by volunteering or donating. Treat every race as 50-50. Make sure you are registered to vote and actually do vote, but then if you have the means to donate, donate. If you have the time to volunteer, or if you can make time, and I think that you should, do that. And when you look at these different election previews, like the one on 538.com, check out some of those races. They'll often be ranked as safe Democrat and Republican, likely Democrat and Republican, and leaning Democrat and Republican. Those leaning and likely are the ones where get out the vote and phone banking and all of that type of activism can actually make a difference. So please, please do it. This is a massive... You should be engaged, period, because this stuff matters. And if you watch the show, you probably already are engaged to some degree. Otherwise, you'd be watching or listening to something else. But this is an opportunity in terms of the importance of these midterms that does not come up all the time. It has been a long time since there have been midterms of this degree of consequence. If you don't plan to vote, okay, I'm speaking directly to you now, please email me and explain to me why you don't plan to vote in November. I can't think of any good reasons not to vote in November, and if you don't plan to vote, other than, you know, there's some logistical reason why you're not going to be voting, if you're going to choose not to vote, please tell me. I want to hear from you, and I also want to hear from you on Twitter, where you can find me at @dpacman. Follow me there. You can also follow the show on Twitter at David Pakman Show. We'll take a quick break. We have a fantastic program for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let me start off just briefly. I do want to thank two really great people today. Vanessa Keitel is today's new member of the day. Vanessa, thank you. I really appreciate your support, the support of everybody, by the way, who signed up in the last 24 hours with our membership special, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the program. Also want to say a big thank you to longtime member and former David Pakman Show intern Sam Miller. Sam's been a member since 2013. He interned for the show, and shout out to both Sam and his mom, both of whom are members, at least, maybe even more family members of Sam's are members currently. Vanessa, Sam, thank you. Join them at www.joinpakman.com. Coupon code available if you want it. It is Vote Soon 18. And yeah, it's a reminder that we've got midterm elections in 7.5 weeks, and you should be registered to vote by now. And you should confirm that you're registered, because a lot of people have started writing to me saying they've been deregistered despite their intentions and wishes. So just another reminder, vote. You can also make pledges of as little as $1 a month on Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. It has been weeks since Hatriot Mail because of the traveling and the vacations, but we're getting back to Hatriot Mail today.
Hey, let's face it. The only logical response to guns is more f***ing guns. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
Like with most Hatriot Mails, no introduction needed whatsoever, but here is a new idea. The concept of pulling me into the Me Too movement, and I guess hoping that I end up having to retire from my own show because I get caught up in it. Take a listen to this.
Can someone go all hashtag me too on this Pacman guy? Please? Pretty please? David Pacman, you are not white and you are not a Hispanic. You are a Jew. Pacman hates light-skinned Gentiles. He calls them Goyim and Shiksas. Racist, two-faced Jew prick. I report CNN and Pacman's as fake news on the Facebox daily.
I admit I've used the words Goyim and Shiksa in my life, and every single time it's been satirical. But I can assure you, not going to happen, my friend. I am not going to get Me Too'd because I've not done anything worthy of being Me Too'd. But what I have done is set up a coupon code, Hatriot40, which saves you 40% off of the membership of your choice. When you use the coupon code Hatriot40 at www.joinpacman.com, not only do you save 40% while getting 100% of the member benefits, 77 Hatriots cry, and that is a really, really great thing. Send a middle finger message to the Hatriots by supporting the David Pacman Show. Use the coupon code Hatriot40 if you would like. There are political decisions that are about complicated policy or nuanced, multi-factor decision-making, and then there are other political decisions that are merely simple moral issues. Like, for example, we make sure that when hurricanes are coming, we put the money in place to help with disaster recovery and hurricane relief. FEMA is the agency, the federal agency, responsible for coordinating and managing hurricane recovery. A lot of people had never heard of FEMA before Hurricane Katrina and the absolutely disastrous federal government response to that hurricane in New Orleans. FEMA is an organization that does many different things. There are funds that are for FEMA, which are specifically for disaster recovery, but then there are also more sort of general funds for FEMA that go into infrastructure and training and readiness. But the big picture is that all of that money together is what funds the ongoing activities of FEMA, which is to help when emergencies take place. Just as a massive hurricane, Hurricane Florence, is bearing down on the southeast of the United States, we learned that the Trump administration decided to take nearly $10 million, $9.8 million, in funding from FEMA's budget and transfer it not to education, not to healthcare, not to who knows what, but to ICE, the organization that is involved in the deportation and separation and detention of immigrant and migrant children. We know about this because Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley has the documents, provided them to MSNBC's Rachel Maddow last night, who is making the point that the funds that were originally allocated to be for FEMA now could end up being used to lock up little kids in cages and internment camps. Now, it seems pretty cut and dry. It's a disgusting budget decision, but the Trump administration does have a defense. I'll tell you what it is, and then we'll think about whether it's a defense that makes sense. The Trump administration claims that even though on paper, yes, $9.8 million was moved from the FEMA budget over to the ICE budget, what they're saying is that that $9.8 million specifically couldn't or wouldn't have been used for a response to Hurricane Florence because of appropriation limitations that they cite. That may be true on the most technical level, but the money was taken from FEMA. So this becomes a sort of this dollar is different than that dollar argument. It becomes sort of a basic conversation about the fungibility of money. Even if these $9.8 million weren't for hurricane relief, when you take away $9.8 million from FEMA, which was going to be used for training and infrastructure and IT, it doesn't really matter whether it was under the ledger heading of response money for Hurricane Florence or for 2018 hurricanes. It's still going to impact FEMA's ability to do response to emergencies, which is what they do. And in fact, FEMA is saying, because we're losing that $10 million, we have to cut back on training, we have to cut back on travel, we have to cut back on public engagement sessions, which are often used to educate the public as to what it is that they should do to be ready for different types of emergencies that might be relevant in their part of the country. And the fact that it wasn't specifically cash for hurricanes doesn't make any difference. And both DHS and FEMA officials, former DHS and FEMA officials, are saying, doesn't matter, this is bad for hurricane relief no matter what, no matter how it was earmarked. We are now at the start of hurricane season, and it does not matter what ledger heading was assigned to this money. This is a disaster, particularly given the disasters that FEMA has experienced over the last 10 and 15 years when it comes to hurricane response. Now, will Trump's base care? It's kind of an interesting question, because on the one hand, we've had situations where there's been a disaster in a bluer area, or at least a part of the country represented by Democratic elected officials. And we've heard from both Republican voters in other parts of the country and Republican elected officials in other parts of the country that they need to pull themselves up for the bootstraps rather than waiting around for federal government handouts. The problem with that argument has been that as soon as there was an issue elsewhere, like for example tornadoes in the center of the country, the same Republicans who said government isn't there to take care of these liberals in New Jersey and New York after Hurricane Sandy were then saying, oh, well, no, I mean, this is different. We have we have tornadoes and floods that are affecting us now, so we do need the federal money. So quite frankly, I don't know what the Trumpists will say about this. We know that there seems to be a significant double standard on when the government should help with relief and shouldn't help with relief, but we now have a hurricane followed by multiple tropical depressions, which could become hurricanes, that are heading in the same direction, mostly to red areas. Maybe that will change their minds. It's a disappointment that for many people on the right, until they're personally affected by something, it's like it doesn't exist, they don't really care. And you know that if there is a disastrous response to Hurricane Florence, if it is bungled, it's not going to be Trump's fault. It's not going to be Republicans' fault. It's going to be the fault of either Obama or Democrats, or it's going to be Hillary's fault. It is not going to be Trump that takes the blame from his supporters if that response is bungled. Truly horrible. And this is not just, I don't really like the phrase just politics, because we're talking about politics, but people's lives hang in the balance here. This is more than just politics, but that's what politics is. It's life and death for many people. I really struggled earlier with how to sort of present this story to you so that it would transmit the true absurdity that it represents. So maybe the best place to start is with some basics. Like, for example, the federal deficit has been skyrocketing under Donald Trump. The federal deficit is up nearly a third, 32%, in the first 11 months of fiscal 2018 over fiscal 2017, up about $222 billion. This is according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Why is the deficit up? Well, the Republican tax law is part of the problem, and increases in spending are part of the problem. If you reduce tax revenues and you increase spending, your deficit is going to go up. Nothing mathematically complicated about that. What is expected to happen next year and the year after? More of the same. The same Congressional Budget Office estimates that we are going to have more deficit growth in 2019, fiscal year 2019, and then even more beyond that in fiscal year 2020. So first of all, let me make very clear, this is not a conversation about whether deficits matter and how much they matter. We've talked a lot in the last year and a half to 2 years about modern monetary theory and the growing reality that a dollar of deficit is not always the same for the economy, that deficit spending on stuff that stimulates the economy is good, right? It's not, or at least it's not necessarily bad. But on the other hand, growing the deficit to give rich people tax cuts that they will put mostly in bank accounts is not good for the economy. But that's not what I want to talk about today, right? We've got that part down. We've talked about that many times. Donald Trump ran on reducing the deficit and on paying down the national debt. The exact opposite is what's actually happening. But I think even more importantly than that, we got these new deficit numbers the day after we found out that when former Trump economic advisor Gary Cohn went to Trump and said, Mr. Trump, or whatever he calls him, Mr. President, who cares, whatever name he had for him, he said, Donnie boy, the federal funds rate is going to go up. Donald Trump had the bright idea of starting to print more money in order to then make money by holding U.S. currency, which he would just print. Now, you can debate whether that's a good idea, but Trump and Republicans have run for decades on economic theory that supposedly claims that you can't do that, that is inflationary and that it is an absolute economic disaster to do that. What we have learned from this experiment are a few different things. Number one, Trump and Republicans don't care about the deficit. I've been saying this for a while. It's a political football. The deficit matters when Barack Obama is in office. I'd say when Bill Clinton's in office, although he had a surplus at the end of his presidency. But when George W. Bush is in office or Donald Trump is in office, who cares about the deficit? We're cutting taxes for the rich and for big corporations. Deficit, I don't even know what you're talking about. That's what we learned, number one, even though we already probably knew that. Number two, and this is not a new theme, Donald Trump has no idea how money works. I'm not talking about economics. He obviously has no idea how economics works. He doesn't seem to understand how money works. And then thirdly, and this is the really sort of damaging, important stuff, Republicans will then use the fact that these deficits exist because they gave tax cuts to the rich to support more bad policy by saying, listen, we've got deficits. We've got to cut Medicare and we've got to cut Social Security benefits, even though they caused the problem. I jokingly, what was that phrase I've been using about the Trump administration? Solutions that don't work to problems that don't exist. This is solutions that don't work to problems you caused. And that's when it starts to ruin people's lives in a real way. And again, I know people are going to write to me because every time I talk about debt and deficit, people write in with basically two different themes. Number one, people write in clearly misunderstanding the difference between debt and deficit. I'm not going to review that today. We've already talked about that before. The other one is I get emails from people saying, David, you don't still think the deficit matters, do you? And the answer is, well, the deficit does matter, but what modern monetary theory is increasingly illuminating is that a dollar of deficit is not always created equal. And what matters is, why did we get into that deficit dollar in the first place? Was it to give a rich person another dollar to stash away in their bank accounts in a totally non-economically stimulative way? Or did that dollar go to give someone health care who now, by virtue of being healthier, is going to work more and make more money, and the government gets more money because they're earning income taxes or collecting income taxes, and that person now has more money to go out and spend it at local businesses? That's what matters, okay? So if you're going to write in and say, David, the deficit doesn't matter at all, I've not seen evidence to suggest it doesn't matter at all, but what I am increasingly convinced of is that what matters is, how did we get into that deficit over the long term? If you're not following The David Pakman Show on Instagram, you're missing a lot of really great stuff, including David Pakman Show videos on IGTV. We are on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Please follow us there, and make sure you're also following me. If you want to see behind-the-scenes pictures from my trip and everything that I've been doing over the last couple of weeks, follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. We will take a quick break. Part 2 of my interview with Andrew Seidel from the Freedom from Religion Foundation next. Then more stories and a lot of really great stuff coming up today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We are continuing our conversation with Andrew Seidel, who is a civil rights and constitutional attorney with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He serves as Director of Strategic Response, works to keep state and church separate. His first book is out in May 2018, was out May 2018, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Let's pick up our conversation, if we can, Andrew, with the idea of the interplayer connection between freedom from and freedom of religion and the First Amendment. Because this is something that I think, we started part one of the interview talking about misconceptions about freedom from religion and freedom of religion and separation of church and state. There are numerous arguments that are often made by those who are de facto supporting discrimination in many cases, that what we might see, what you and I might see, or some others who have sort of the political leanings that we might have, see as discrimination among religious lines is merely the expression of speech, and that is something that cannot be curtailed. Is there a gray area when we talk about freedom from and of religion and speech, or are the limits pretty clear as to when we're talking about one versus the other?
Sure. Well, and just a quick note, the book comes out in May 2019. I think that was my fault. But I think, to your question, the limits used to be clear, but in recent, say, 2 decades, there has been a push, and this is deliberate, it's a legal strategy by the religious right to conflate religious freedom and free speech. The goal was, because free speech has been so carefully protected in this nation, and because religious liberty is really not under threat in this country, right? Especially if you are a Christian, the danger that a government which is run, how much of our federal legislature is run by Christians? You're talking 99% probably. There was no real danger to Christianity from a religious freedom standpoint in this nation. So one of the things that the religious right started doing was taking their arguments to court along free speech lines. And they did this successfully in the school context, and now they're starting to expand it out, and you saw it in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case kind of writ large. The striking thing about that case is there was no request for a specific cake that said something. They didn't actually even get a chance, this couple didn't even actually get a chance to discuss with the baker what they wanted on their cake. So he didn't have any idea of what expression he was going to have to give. So there was actually no free speech issue in that case just because of the facts. But again, they did a really great job of promoting that narrative and conflating it with the religious freedom narrative. So the lines used to be very clear, but they've done a good job from a legal standpoint of blurring them.
Yeah, and it's being done it's not being done in good faith. In other words, as you're pointing out, a good job is done because that side benefits from the blurring of those lines, and that kind of gets me to the Trump administration. Where is an organization like the Freedom from Religion Foundation most concerned when it comes to the actions of the current administration in the context of separation of church and state, religious freedom, discrimination, etc.?
That's a tough question to answer. We sued the Trump administration over their religious liberty executive order that they put out on the National Day of Prayer last year in 2017. We took them to court that same day, actually, over that. We've sued them about the White House Bible study that they have, about getting access to records to that. I think overall, probably the most alarming thing, if you care about a secular government, if you care about religious freedom in the true sense, and state-church separation, is the reshaping of the federal judiciary is incredibly alarming. If Trump and Mitch McConnell get their way, about 1 in every 7 judges on the federal bench will have been appointed by Trump by the end of the year. And that is just hugely alarming. And then, of course, there could be 2 on the Supreme Court that he'd already have appointed. So that, to me, is probably the biggest problem that we currently are facing, because it's a problem that we're going to have for 30 or 40 years.
So how does, we've all started to read about Brett Kavanaugh's ideas about abortion, for example, and there's a very clear link between religion and opposition to abortion. But it's more complex than that, right? The ways in which a Supreme Court justice, for decades in many cases, can influence issues of separation of church and state go way beyond whether Roe v. Wade might someday be repealed. Can you talk about the different ways in which a Supreme Court justice can impact these issues, the types of cases that come up?
I mean, absolutely, and it's virtually without limit the impact they can have, and we're actually already seeing it just with the retirement of Anthony Kennedy. Lower court judges got an idea of what type of nominee Trump would put up, and they're starting to alter their opinions. You know, in 2 of the cases that FFRF has taken, we got a cross on public land in a public park in Florida struck down, declared unconstitutional. No cross has ever been upheld as constitutional in a public park. And the same thing, there was a cross on a city seal in Pennsylvania. Both courts struck those down, but in the opinions that the court wrote, they put all this regret. They said, you know, we wish we didn't have to decide this case this way. We think that establishment clause and state-church separation, that area of law is a shambles. The court needs to step in and overturn our opinion. We're deciding the way precedent dictates, but we think we shouldn't have to. And decisions like that were unthinkable a couple of years ago. And I think had the election gone differently and appointees to the Supreme Court gone differently, I do not believe opinions like that would have been written.
So is that like a signal? Is that in the same way that
absolutely.
Apologies for what some might find to be a bad analogy, but is this sort of like we've seen white supremacists claim that even though Trump's not really saying the thing, he's signaling in a certain way where if you know the language, you understand what he's kind of getting at? Is that the same type of thing that we're seeing courts signal?
I don't even think it's a dog whistle. I think they're being very open about it. And the reason they're being open about it is because we know, for instance, what Brett Kavanaugh thinks of the wall of separation. He has specifically said that the wall of separation is a bad metaphor based on bad history. He said that basically any religious artifact in this nation, whether it be prayer before the legislature, in God we trust on our money, under God in the pledge, as long as there's a history and tradition behind it, that it should be upheld. Essentially, he's arguing that if something has been around for a long time, we aren't going to apply the First Amendment to it as long as religion's involved. And I mean, you can imagine where that would leave us in terms of slavery, segregation, women's rights. That idea that history and tradition allows us to do an end around the Constitution is ridiculous, but it's something that he has specifically, and he talked about it again in his hearings, and this was just in a speech last year that he said that he is a wrecking ball aimed at the wall of separation. Is a very dangerous nominee.
That all being said, and sort of thinking about Trump and Mike Pence as well, because that sort of relates to my next question, we don't have to speculate about impeachment or the 25th Amendment or anything like that, but I have been clear that there are ways in which Mike Pence would be a bigger disaster than Donald Trump. Not in all ways, but there are ways in which he would. It strikes me that because of his ideological religious background, when it comes to the issues you work on, Pence could actually be more of a threat. Do you agree?
I think that could very well be true. If we're talking about our particular area of the law and keeping state and church separate, I do think that's probably true. You know, Mike Pence infamously signed the Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act into law a couple years ago, despite huge outcry and backlash to doing so. And that is what we were talking about earlier. It is a law that redefines religious liberty, and it essentially gives that license to discriminate, or it attempts to give that license to discriminate to Christians. So he would certainly be a bigger threat, I think, than Trump to state-church separation, though Trump is pretty bad so far.
Last thing I want to touch on, when it comes to fighting some of these cases in court, my sense is, because most people aren't lawyers, they may not understand the sort of details on which some of these decisions can ultimately hinge. So can you give us a little bit of a sense of the spectrum of, like you mentioned, a cross on public grounds, or I think maybe in parks you said, has never been upheld as constitutional. That seems super cut and dry, but can you give us some examples of how sometimes it can seem as though, oh, this is obviously unconstitutional, this obviously violates separation of church and state, but that the devil sort of ends up being in the details, and technicalities or seeming technicalities can determine whether or not something is upheld or struck down?
Sure. So first, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we are 15-1 since the beginning of 2016 in court. We are winning these cases time and time again. But when we do lose, especially before 2016, it's often on technicalities. And one of the biggest ones is called standing. And basically, this means that courts are saying, you, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, or your plaintiffs, don't have an injury or an interest in this case, so we're not even going to hear the case. It's not, they aren't getting to the merits of the legal question. They're just saying, you don't even get to bring this case. A really good example, a really frustrating example, is the National Day of Prayer. And I mean, a National Day of Prayer would be, I think, to any law student, to anybody even mildly versed in this, that would seem like a state church problem, probably a violation. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation took a case on that. We won it at the federal district court level, the lowest level, and then it was appealed to the circuit court. And the circuit court said, you cannot bring this case. And if that means that nobody can bring this case and nobody can challenge the National Day of Prayer, so be it. So essentially what they did was, using jurisdiction, using this fiction of jurisdiction, they said that nobody can challenge a clearly unconstitutional law. Citizens don't have the ability to enforce the Constitution. And I mean, it's an injustice of the highest degree, but it happens all the time.
Andrew, you and the organization are doing really great work. We've been speaking with Andrew Seidel, who's a civil rights and constitutional attorney with the Freedom from Religion Foundation. The book is out May of next year, May of 2019, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Andrew, thank you so much for talking to us today.
It was truly a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There are lots of really serious policy analyses to be done, and that we regularly do, about the current administration, the current Republicans in the House, the Senate, Donald Trump. But sometimes it's less about policy and more about just the patently vile and gross nature of Donald Trump as an individual. And nothing is more emblematic of that than this picture of Donald Trump pumping his fists in excitement as he was entering the 9/11 memorial in Pennsylvania. And as you know, yesterday was the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We focused on the cost of post-9/11 wars in our coverage yesterday. And one of the things Donald Trump did was to go to Pennsylvania, to the memorial for the victims of Flight 93, which crashed there. And on the way in, Trump looked like a little kid waiting to get on the newest ride at Disney World, not like an adult who understands the somber and sad circumstances and meaning of that memorial. And people are going to write in and they'll say, David, you know, I heard that Trump was actually pumping his fists because he was going to see a kid with cancer who was meeting him at that thing. Trump was seen with his powerful and violent thumbs up all over 9/11 related stuff. And this has been a trend with Trump. And it's not about being fake outraged or being offended or anything of the sort. Trump's policy ideas and his actions are what make him fundamentally unqualified to be president of the United States. You don't need superficial insensitivity, which he has plenty of, to make the case that Trump shouldn't be the president. This is about more broadly understanding that we have an underdeveloped child running the country, and Trump's tweet on 9/11 sort of not insensitive but totally dumb, and shows his lack of awareness of the gravity of what we're talking about when we talk about the 9/11 anniversary. Donald Trump tweeting, 17 years since September 11th, exclamation point. And it's not just now that Trump is off the charts about 9/11. When 9/11 first happened, Trump called into, I think it was into Fox News, and his remark was that because the Twin Towers had fallen, because of a terrorist attack, mind you, his building was now the tallest in Lower Manhattan. This is a person with a deficient or faulty character. It's like a broken personality. And it's a real embarrassment for the entire country. And for everybody who's not embarrassed by Trump, you're a part of that embarrassment. You're a part of the problem. And if you're not able to see this behavior and realize that it is the behavior of a damaged, dangerous person who needs to be removed from office right away before he does even more damage, you are part of the problem. And I know people are going to get mad. Why? Because they get mad no matter what I say. I know that if you're running for office, candidates should use inclusive language, and that's where maybe Hillary Clinton was wrong to use the term deplorables about Trump supporters. She wasn't wrong about the term. It was probably just bad strategy to use that term. It wasn't a good strategic term to use. I'm not running for anything. There's no other candidate I'm trying to get you to vote for right now. If you don't see what's going on, you are part of the problem. And what we need to do, and by we I mean not only progressives, but I also mean right-wingers who understand the problem, we need to do what we can to remove the guy from office as soon as possible, and by that I mean like yesterday. And if you think that individually fist pumping as you enter a 9/11 memorial isn't notable in any way, just remember what the right did when Barack Obama was president of the United States and he wore a tan suit or chose the wrong type of mustard, okay? If that was disrespectful or elitist and worthy of discussion on Fox News and by Rush Limbaugh and Hannity and all of those people, then what is this? What is this? Answer that question for me. I am begging you. So I have awesome news for you today. It has been, the last year and a half has been a difficult one for the David Pakman Show, even though the audience has grown significantly. We've had a number of different financial sort of circumstances for the show, starting with YouTube adpocalypse and some tech issues and studio problems. And yesterday I made the big announcement that the David Pakman Show is going to be abandoning David Pakman Show Studios. We are leaving at the end of our current lease, which has been almost 3 years, and we are going to be moving to a state-of-the-art facility with effectively the fastest internet available in the Boston area, short of getting a $1,000 to $2,000 a month direct fiber line or something along those lines. We are going to be increasing the production quality of the program in other ways. And yesterday, what I said was, I am not doing a Kickstarter campaign. I'm not doing an Indiegogo campaign. We have basically fronted all of the costs of doing this. But what I am offering is the opportunity to get a membership at half price, and one of two very generous longtime contributors to the program will pay for the other $30. Membership's normally $60. And I said yesterday that I had 200 of these discounted memberships available. I am extraordinarily pleased to tell you that 67 of those 200 memberships are already spoken for in just the first 24 hours. I woke up this morning to nearly 50 emails from people saying, David, I want one of those half-price memberships, and they continue to trickle in during the day. And I don't know if it was the latte language I used that resonated with people. I said, if you buy one fancy latte a month, what we're talking about is that amount of money a year to support the program. And a bunch of people emailed me and they said, David, I get fancy lattes all the time, and it would be very easy for me to just get one, skip one latte a month. I want one of those half-price memberships. Other people said, David, I don't even drink lattes, and that made me realize I'm already saving $30 a year because I don't drink those lattes. Give me one of those half-price memberships. So let's keep it going. 67 of these half-price memberships spoken for. I am your personal membership concierge. So as I said yesterday, I'm personally handling all what hopefully will be 200 new membership requests. People taking the opportunity, not surprisingly, I guess I would say, when they email me at david@davidpakman.com or through the website contact form to say, David, I want one of those half-price memberships, and here's an interview idea. Or I'd love one of those half-price memberships, and here's a story you should really look into. So I'm okay with that. I am willing to let people bend my ear a little bit in the mission of continuing to grow and support the David Pakman Show. So take it as an opportunity to pitch a guest or tell me that I'm doing something right, wrong, or okay, or pitch a story, whatever the case may be. But we have 133 of these remaining. David@davidpakman.com. I am every single one of you who has signed up. I have personally handled those requests, and I hope that we get 133 more. And I probably expected, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 in the first 24 hours to be requested, but 67. We're off to a great start, and at some point I will really go into the details of all of the changes that are going to be happening, which I think are going to be fantastic for the program. But for now, I sort of laid it out yesterday. Internet speed, actual sound isolated and soundproofed production facilities, which we have been dealing with major noise issues in our current studio for years, and it has been, to call it grating on the nerves is probably somewhat of an understatement. So thanks to everybody. Get in touch. 133 of the 200 memberships remain. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call any time of day. And here's an interesting call that came in. Yesterday we talked about, or maybe it was the day before, we talked about Donald Trump sort of fear-mongering that if he were to be impeached, the United States would turn into a third world country. And what I pointed out was that whether you use the term third world or developing country, the United States is actually closer to a developing country than a developed country in a number of different metrics. Access to healthcare is one example. Proficiency on math and science is one that is an absolute disaster. Infant mortality in the United States, very closely related to access to healthcare, more in line with some of those developing countries than developed. And this idea of developing versus developed countries is the subject of today's voicemail. Let's take a listen to it.
Hey David, this is Aaron from Germany. Just wanted to ask you quickly, how do you think should we help the so-called third world, like poor countries in Africa and so on? How do you think can they be helped? Sorry if this has been asked before. I only watched your show recently, but I love it.
I'm no expert in international aid and helping developing countries to develop, but I've read a couple of books about this and watched a couple of good documentaries. And what I am more convinced of than ever is that just giving stuff to the developing world is not going to be a solution. And the sort of emblematic example of this is you hear about many programs to, for example, give shoes to people in developing countries, in very poor countries, because many of them don't have shoes, and it would be great to have shoes. They would be better able to work and get to school and whatever else. That's all true, but the problem is that when you give shoes to people in developing countries, you're doing nothing to help the development of the business world and of the economy, and you're actually making it so that the shoe business in those places can never succeed because everybody's getting free shoes from some richer country. That's one example. Now, this is not an argument to say we shouldn't do aid. Of course we should do aid. The important thing is to do aid in ways that is not going to be a substitute for development within that economy. So for example, vaccinations. Vaccinations make perfect sense as something to do via aid because people will be healthier, you will have a larger workforce, you will have a bigger educational pool of people who are alive to become educated. That's very different than saying, oh, people don't have shoes, we'll get some company from the West to give everybody shoes, because that is, it sort of goes back to this idea of giving someone fish versus teaching them to fish. Now, there will be some on the right who will hear me say this and they'll say, well, hold on a second, David. Isn't that an argument against social welfare programs in the United States? And the answer is, of course, no. Making sure that people have health care and make sure people have a basic level of nutrition, for example, that is enabling a population to better develop their own economy, to be able to exist in the world. That is not what we are talking about here. I'm talking about something very, very different. So, good question. I don't find it, there's a very particular history to where the term third world came from, and it's not the nicest thing, but I'm not really into language policing that term. I use the term developing countries. It seems to be the term that's increasingly used in economic circles. I'm not offended by third world. I know what you mean. The terms can be used interchangeably, even if they mean marginally different things. But I think the answer to helping third world countries is helping them to develop their own economies. And I think a very interesting example of this, by the way, which I want to talk about more, and maybe we'll do an interview about, is Nigeria. Nigeria is very quickly becoming one of the most populous and one of the biggest economies in the world. And the next 20 years in Nigeria will be fascinating, undoubtedly, and maybe something we'll talk about in the future. On today's bonus show, we will talk about Elon Musk and Tesla. I have a big announcement to make about my Tesla investment. Some people can probably guess what it is. We will talk about mindfulness, meditation, and pain, and we will also talk about what's going on in New York with Governor Cuomo and challenger Cynthia Nixon. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. Get access by becoming a member at www.joinpacman.com or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.